God has a way of putting us where he wants us. Can I say that again? God has a way of putting us where he wants us so that he can use us. And oftentimes, those may not be the most comfortable places for us to be. I invite you to turn back with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 9 as we begin this morning. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11, where Solomon writes these words in the New Living Translation, is how the New Living Translation translates it. I've observed something under the sun, Solomon says. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race. The strongest warrior doesn't always win the battle. The wise sometimes go hungry, and the skillful are not necessarily wealthy. And those who are educated don't always lead successful lives. It's all decided by chance, by being in the right place at the right time. How many of us, when we look at that last sentence, think things just happen? Everything that happens does so because of coincidence or because we're just in the right place at the right time. If we look at that at just face value, wow. That's kind of shocking, isn't it? But we have to remember this. The Bible wasn't written in English. The Bible was written in Hebrew and Greek, and sometimes there just isn't a great translation for some of the original language words. And I think the word that the New Living Translation uses, chance, just seems to be one of those. The word that they're trying to translate is a Hebrew word called kara. It's one of those words whose basic meaning is, as you see on the screen, an encounter with no prearrangement. Now, in English, we might say that those are things that just happen. They're just coincidences. And in our minds, we have a picture of what that means. But here's something I want to tell you that I think challenges that, and that is that in the Hebrew, there is no word for the English word coincidence. What the word kara carries with it is an understanding that we don't see if all we look at is the English translation. And that is that things are God ordained. It's not just being in the right place at the right time. Things are God ordained. Because God has a way of putting us where he wants and needs us. Such appears to be the case in the life of a young lady by the name of Irina Sendler. She was a Polish Catholic nurse who lived in Warsaw, Poland, moved there with her husband before World War II broke out. And she became a social worker in charge of providing assistance to the people who were in need. Her work gave her access to the Jewish community that was living in the Warsaw Ghetto, to whom she then provided medicine, clothing, and a lot of other necessities. For those not familiar with the term Warsaw Ghetto, it was the largest forced settlement that the Nazis put together in Warsaw, where all of the Jews were herded up, taken out of their homes, and forced to live in this little tiny section of the town of Warsaw. And it was from the Warsaw Ghetto that millions of Jews were taken, put on trains, taken to concentration camps, and then put to death. Sharon and I have both been to the Warsaw Ghetto. And I'll tell you, there's nothing that you can experience in this country that even comes close to watching and looking at the things, the monuments and the posters and the signs that show what happened to the people who were living in that part of Warsaw. For Sendler, after watching thousands die every month, she couldn't stand it anymore, so she joined an organization called Council to Aid Jews. Putting themselves at risk, Irina and a handful of other workers saved as many Jewish children as they could from being deported or from just dying in the Warsaw Ghetto. What they did is they started with orphans. They would hide them in caskets and potato sacks, transport them in ambulances or through tunnels just to get them out of the area unseen. And once out of the area, Irina helped place them in convents or other non-Jewish homes. As the situation worsened, she would even work with Jewish parents who were in the ghetto just to get their children out of that area safely. And when the war was over, it was estimated that this group had saved no less than 2,500 children. Irina Sendler could be pointed to as saving 400 of those children all on her own. I think her life is an example of one who trusted God to do the impossible, even if there was great risk to her own life, because God had placed her where he needed her to be. I'm pretty sure if Irina knew what she was getting into ahead of time, she may not have embraced that assignment to go to Warsaw, but like so many other humans, so many other Christians, so many other believers, God used them during this horrid period of human history and placed her in a place where she could provide comfort that nobody else could. And she could save hundreds of kids from death. I think from time to time it's good for us just to step back and see where it is that God has us, and to reflect on how he's accomplishing his work here on this earth for his kingdom, even if we don't fully embrace where we are right now. Because God has a way of putting us where he wants us so that he can use us, even if it's not comfortable for us. A couple quick biblical examples, I think, that prove that that's always been the case. One is Joseph. We read about Joseph being sold by his brothers and ending up in Egypt, and he went through this roller coaster of highs and lows when he was in Egypt, finally became the right-hand man to Pharaoh. It was his job to oversee the food chain, basically before and after a severe famine hit the area. And it just so happens that the very brothers who sold him into slavery along with his father had to come before Joseph himself and beg for food. And it was only through Joseph's interaction that then the nation of Israel was able to form in Egypt and become God's people. It was because God had Joseph in the right place at the right time. And he was able to do something that no one else could do. A few centuries later, we'll get it out, a beautiful Jewish woman was entered into a beauty contest by her uncle. It was a contest that was sponsored by the king, who was looking to replace his queen. Esther ended up being the chosen one that the king chose. In the process, she was able to intervene and save basically the nation of Israel because of this diabolical plot that she exposed that would have wiped out the Israelites just like the Germans tried to do during the Holocaust. At just the right time, at just the right manner, she interceded. She uncovered those things and did what only she could do because of her relationship with the king. Now, whether or not Esther enjoyed some of the trappings of being queen, we don't know, but we have no idea that she knew going into this whole process what she would be able to do, because God put her in the right place at the right time to do what only she could do. God has a way of putting all of us where he wants us to be, even if it's not the most comfortable place for us to be. As we start to wrap up our spring message series, where we've been looking at people who went from being outside of Jesus' circle to becoming inside of Jesus' circle, we've already seen how easy it is to take that step across the line and become a follower of Christ. We've also seen some of the amazing things that God makes available to us, the miraculous powers, in fact, that were made available to people who were a part of Jesus' circle. Today, what we want to do is to look at how following Jesus Being inside Jesus' circle sometimes makes it hard for us to negotiate where we are. But if we remember that God has placed us there so that we can do something that maybe no one else can do, it can make it a little more bearable, can it not? For us to be where we are at this point in our lives. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at two men who I think fit this category very well. In fact, we read about them being together after the death of Jesus. Turn with me to the New Testament in John chapter 19, beginning in verse 38. Two men that we're going to talk about today. Verse 38 says, "Afterward, Joseph of Arimathea, who had been a secret disciple of Jesus," parenthesis, because he feared the Jewish leaders, asked Pilate for permission to take down Jesus' body. When Pilate gave permission, Joseph came and took the body away. With him came Nicodemus, the man who had come to Jesus at night. He brought about 75 pounds of perfumed ointment made of myrrh and aloes. Following Jewish burial custom, they wrapped Jesus' body with the spices and long sheets of linen cloth. The place of the crucifixion was near a garden where there was a new tomb never before used. Other scripture writers tell us that that tomb belonged to Joseph. Verse 42, "And so because it was the day of preparation for the Jewish Passover, and since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there." Joe and Nick, let's just abbreviate their names that way today. Joe and Nick were two men who were definitely inside of Jesus' circle, even though that wasn't public knowledge at the time. We'll see in a couple of minutes why they were more covert in their faith than overt, because it was very awkward because of where they were in life to navigate everything because they were followers of Jesus. Before we look at what that awkwardness was, though, let's look at a couple of things that they did out of that text that I just read, okay? What Nick and Joe did was they stepped up when others ran away. They stepped up when others ran away. You know, the crucifixion of Jesus had this way of bringing to light a lot of different things about a lot of different people. We saw last week how it was a group of women who stood faithfully by Jesus to the bitter end, and therefore they were the ones who were rewarded by God to be able to experience the resurrection first. So where were all of Jesus' male followers? Where was Peter and James and the rest of the apostles? I mean, after all, Peter had said, "Jesus, I will die for you if anything begins to happen." Where was he? Well, turn back with me to Mark's gospel and we'll find out what happened to them. Mark says that in the garden, after the Judas and the soldiers arrived, beginning in verse 46 of Mark chapter 14, he says this: "They," that being the soldiers, "grabbed Jesus and arrested him. But one of the men with Jesus pulled out his sword and struck the high priest's slave, slashing off his ear." We know who that was, right? That was Peter. Jesus asked them, "Am I some dangerous revolutionary that you've come with swords and clubs to arrest me? Why didn't you arrest me in the temple? I was there among you teaching every day." But these things all happened to fulfill what the scriptures say about me. And one of those things was this: then all of his disciples deserted him and ran away. That was prophesied. That's exactly what happened. One young man following behind was clothed only in a long linen shirt, and when the mob tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and ran away naked. Peter and the other men who had followed Jesus for 3 years had ran away when Jesus was arrested. And in case if you're ever wondering who the streaker was, okay, most people believe that's John Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark. Okay, that's just kind of how he injects himself into the Bible. The fact was, all of Jesus' disciples ran away when he was arrested. Now, granted, Peter came back during the trial period, and he was at least outside, and he denied that he knew Jesus 3 times. And John came back when he was hanging on the cross, because Jesus then gave command of his mother to John. So they came back, but they were kind of incognito at the time. According to Jewish laws and customs, it was essential that the dead bodies of Jewish people would be buried as quickly as possible. And history records for us that it was really up to the magistrate who was in charge of the crucifixion what happened to the bodies. In this case, it would have been Pilate. They had to say as to who got the body and what could happen with them. And sometimes when the body wasn't claimed by the family, all that happened was they were taken off the cross, they were thrown over the ledge, and their bodies were either eaten by the wild animals or they just decayed there next to the crucifixion scene. That was not uncommon, they say, because people did not want to be identified with people who were crucified. So for Joseph and Nicodemus to come forward and take possession of Jesus' dead body, that was a big deal. And we'll see even more in a minute why the fact that Joseph going to Pilate was a huge deal. Considering all of Jesus' closest followers were in hiding because they were afraid that something might happen to them because they were connected to Jesus, here were these two men who stepped up and did something that God needed done. The second thing that they did out of the passage that I read out of John 19 was that they sacrificed for the one that they believed in. Not only did they step up, but they sacrificed. In Matthew's account of this, he tells us that Joseph was a very rich man from the town of Arimathea. Now, good luck finding Arimathea on your maps, okay? People don't know where it's at exactly. They think maybe it was a town about 20 miles northeast of Jerusalem. Maybe it's mentioned in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1, where it's talking about the parents of Samuel. They're not 100% sure. For Joseph to have a freshly cut tomb in Jerusalem that we're told in the other gospel writers, that would have cost a lot of money. He would have had to have been rich to do that. And the fact that he was willing to let Jesus' body lay there, that was a big sacrifice. Keep in mind, from where we sit, we know that Jesus was only going to camp out there. But everybody else's mindset at the time, that's where he was going to stay for a much longer period of time. And so the fact that Joseph was willing to, quote, donate his tomb by this garden, I think says a whole lot about what he thought about Jesus. So that's what Joseph sacrificed. What about Nicodemus? You know what? Nicodemus had to be a fairly rich man as well. We read in John chapter 19 that he brought 75 pounds of perfumed ointments made from myrrh and aloes. You might say Nicodemus was willing to assume the role of the embalmer. Okay? Now, they didn't have all the techniques that we have today, but what they would do is they would take all these spices and they would then put them on this cloth. They would wrap the bodies in these long cloths, and that would kind of control the decomposition. It would control the odor. It was the best that they could do at the time. But here's the amazing thing about what Nicodemus did. He brought 75 pounds of these spices. Everybody I read said that 75 pounds was the amount that was used to bury a king. Not a normal person. A normal person would have used much less of those items. So for Nick to have purchased out of his own pocket and brought these things to wrap Jesus' body in, I think says a whole lot. Not only about the fact that he was following him, but that he also believed in Jesus. The fact that they were willing to step up and sacrifice on Jesus' behalf, I think, shows that they truly were in his circle. They were a part of Jesus' followers at that time. But the gospel writers make a point that they did so overtly. They were very careful in what they did. Do you know any Christians like that today? They tell you that they're Christian, and you kind of know that they are, but you really don't see them expressing that very openly on a day-to-day basis. They're a little more like Nicholas and Joseph. They're kind of covert in what they do. And sometimes we look at people like that and we say, man, they just need more faith. They just need to be more vocal about what they believe about Jesus because God will take care of them. But you know what? We're going to get to the final point now about these two men that I've asked you to wait for, and that is that they were in a very awkward position. They really were. God had put these two men in a place that caused them, that almost forced them to be able to do these things. They had to do them exactly the way they did. Because the thing that they did, the third thing that they did, was that they had sentenced Jesus to death. Not only had they stepped up, not only had they sacrificed, but they had sentenced Jesus to death. Not just the two of them. They were a part of a group known as the Sanhedrin, or the council, that were responsible for the whole effort of putting Jesus to death. Can you begin to feel a little bit of the tension that would have been in Joseph and Nicodemus's life? Can you feel a little bit of the confliction that they had as they were a part of those meetings where Jesus was sentenced to die, and yet in their hearts they believed and they followed him? Can you put yourself in that position and even begin to imagine what that must have felt like? The Sanhedrin was a very complex organization. It really was. Sometimes we want to make it simple, but it really wasn't. It was about 71 Jewish people who had been given the task of overseeing and administering the Jewish laws. And their role became even more important when the Jews were under the leadership or under the oversight of some other country, like they were in this case with the Romans, because they had to act as the judicial system who would investigate, try, and then pronounce the judgment on people who broke the, quote, law that God had given to his people. Who made up this group? Who were Joseph and Nicodemus? Well, you know what? What we know is this Sanhedrin was made up of different groups of people from within the Jewish community. There were Pharisees, there were Sadducees, there were just rabbis. And you know what? There were just some people who had a lot of money, who had the influence that was necessary to be a part of that organization. As is always the case, when religion and politics get too intertwined, the ruling powers and the spiritual authorities had a little trouble sorting out all the details when it came to Jesus' death. Think about this. Jesus withstood 6 trials on the night that he was tried. 3 with the private sector of the Romans, and 3 with the religious leaders. It was complicated how all of this was working together. But what we can't deny is the Sanhedrin had a lot of power. At least they thought they did. What they probably didn't realize is that they were just being used by God to ultimately provide the atonement for mankind's sin through Jesus' death. It took this ongoing conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders, and the fact that all of these crowds were so supportive of Jesus and these leaders feeling threatened, that actually God was able to do what he wanted to do all along, which was to redeem mankind. They may have thought they were doing something original. The Sanhedrin. Man, I bet they thought they were something special, when really God was in control of the whole situation. And for Joseph and Nicodemus to be a part of that council to begin with, and as awkward as it was for them to navigate all of those relationships, you know what? They were there for a reason. And if you think about it this way, they were there so that the validity of the resurrection could be upheld today. Because of who they were and what they did and the record that we have today, just think about it. The resurrection has validity. There is substance to that, and we can believe it just because of their relationships outside of just being a follower of Jesus Christ. These 2 men were placed by God in the Sanhedrin so that they could do what needed to be done. Not just after his death. Now, some would suggest that Joseph of Arimathea was a personal friend of Pilate. Can you imagine that? How else would he have such access to the Roman leader of the area to just walk in and say, hey, I want Jesus' body, and the Roman leader to say, yeah, he's yours. Then there's Nicodemus. I think sometimes we miss the significance of Nicodemus being in the role that he was on the Sanhedrin until we go back to John chapter 7 and we read about an event that happened there. You see, early in Jesus' ministry, these same religious leaders were looking for some way that they could destroy Jesus. They were looking to kill him early on and get rid of him, but it just wasn't part of God's timing. Look with me back at John chapter 7, where the Jewish leaders had sent out guards to pick up Jesus, and the guards went to arrest Jesus, basically, but they got so caught up in his teaching. They were so amazed by his teaching. They come back to the religious leaders empty-handed. And boy, are they upset. They are so upset. Look what Nicodemus does. John chapter 7, verse 50. Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus before, and who was one of them, said to them, "Does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does?" Then they replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." Both men were put in this organization for God to use them exactly when he needed them. And from my perspective, what Nicodemus did was he kept God's time frame on track. He was the one who kept the religious leaders from killing Jesus prematurely for all of the efforts to take place that needed to take place so that we could experience the unlimited grace of God. That's how important these two men were, even though they were in a very, very awkward position in life. Was it coincidence? Or was it God preordained? You know, history has many stories of people who Solomon described in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 of just being in the right place at the right time and things happening because of chance. I think one of those people that people look at nowadays might be the name Stephen Bradbury. I don't know if you know that name or not. He was an Olympic ice speed skater for the continent of Australia. It was February 16th, 2002. It was the Winter Olympics, and it was the night in Salt Lake City, Utah, where the finals, or all of the competition, would take place for the 1,000-meter short course speed skating competition. Bradbury was not the fastest skater, but he qualified to be in the quarterfinals just by enough. He then qualified to be in the semifinals. What people don't know about Bradbury was that he'd been a skater for almost 12 years. He had done all of this training, all of this work without any corporate sponsors and or endorsements. He funded his own training for 12 years. And during that time, he had experienced a lot of hardship and a lot of suffering. One time he was impaled by one of the other skaters' skates. He lost 4 liters of blood on the ice. And it took 111 stitches to put him back together after that particular incident. That was just one. Then he fell and broke his neck. And the doctor said, "You'll never skate again." And he said, "Yes, I will." So he trained and he worked to the point where he was able to compete in the 2002 Winter Olympics. And what happened in that night of February the 16th in 2002 may just seem like chance or coincidence for a lot of people. Because you see, in the semifinals, his time was just slightly less than what it needed to be, or slightly more, I should say, than what it needed to be for him to be able to qualify for the finals. But after review of another heat of that race, what the leaders determined was another skater, the one who was actually ahead of him in the time, who was beating him out for the finals, was disqualified. Because he had caused the fall of all of the other skaters in that heat that then disqualified him. So Bradbury then becomes eligible for the finals. He got to the finals. He took his place. Everybody knew he wasn't as quick or as good as everybody else. But he competed to the best of his ability. He was in the back of the pack the whole race. From the time the gun went off to the end, until almost the end. He was in the back of the pack. And then something happened. in the final turn, a Chinese skater lost his control of himself, fell, and took out the rest of the field. Except for who? Stephen Bradbury. He avoided the carnage, and he skated across the finish line and received the first ever Olympic gold medal for Australia in speed skating. Coincidence? Chance? Or God ordained? I don't know. But what I do know is this. Those of us who are inside Jesus' circle are more than likely going to be used by God to do something that nobody else can do. So here's my application question for you this morning. Where is it that God has placed you right now so that you can do what only you can do and that He needs you to do? What is it? Even if it's in circumstances that feel a little awkward and uncomfortable to you, where has God put you to do what He needs you to do? Here's what I know. Every one of us has the opportunity to be in the right place at the right time, if indeed God has placed us inside Jesus' circle to do what He wants us to do. Why are you where you are?